Hi, I'm Esther.
And I'm Sean.
I write about AI news here at Tech Target in Massachusetts.
And I edit Esther's stories.
We're here to talk with tech experts about everything AI and ChatGPT.
Don't forget Google Gemini.
Whether it's who's ahead in the generative AI race, the metaverse, digital twins, or even the latest in autonomous vehicles, we've got it covered. Right, Sean?
Yep, we've got it covered. Hi, I'm Sean Sutner of Tech Target. Our guest today here on the Targeting AI podcast is David Glick, SVP of Enterprise Business Services at Walmart. Welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
So you are Senior Vice President of Enterprise Business Services. What is Enterprise Business Services at Walmart?
Sure. Enterprise Business Services combines a bunch of different organizations, but starting with when you check out at Walmart stores or on the website, we power the checkout. I own finance technology. We take data from all around the company and we close the books every month. People technology does a variety of different things to support our associates, but probably the most important is paying our associates accurately and timely every couple of weeks. And finally, the associate digital experience. In addition to the technology, I own finance ops and people ops. And so we've taken these operational teams and moved them close to the engineers so that we look at their processes and find out where we can streamline those and automate them with technology.
That's a pretty big portfolio, but I think you're up for it because of your background. I'll ask you a little bit about your background later, but so you've said in the past in various venues that Walmart is got to be looked at as a big tech company as well as a big retailer, bricks and mortar online. So you have 25,000 engineers. So how are you a big tech company? How does that work?
Sure. We both have 25,000 engineers. And if you think about how many companies have 25,000 engineers, it's a very short list. But also it's the scale and the depth of the technology that we're working on and the quality of the engineering talent we have. We have started a technical fellow program where we're bringing sort of principal and staff engineers from big tech companies in, as well as having a huge presence West Coast, Bentonville, and India. And so we're excited about where we're applying things like GenAI to all different portions of the company.
Yeah, that Tech Fellow program sounds really interesting. So, all right. So, what are the different use cases for AI and especially Gen AI at Walmart that you're really leaning into these days?
Sure. We're doing AI and GenAI all over the place. And you may have seen Doug's keynote at CES. We're looking at every piece of the organization and figuring out how can we support it with generative AI. And it's great to have a CEO who supports this from top to bottom, not just giving lip service, but making sure we're driving this across the whole organization. In my area, we've taken sort of two directions. One is sort of tops down. Let's pick a few use cases and go deep into those. One of those is My Assistant. And so we have built a consumer grade tool for our associates to interact with things like direct deposit, expense reports, approvals, and things like this. So we're not going into a bunch of third party experiences. We have a unified experience. On top of that, we've built this conversational chatbot called via GenAI called My Assistant. And they can ask it, let me start a press release. Or one of the things we do at the beginning of projects is set out guiding principles. And so I asked one of my team members to send me, what are the guiding principles for this project? And they sent me this beautifully, well formatted, great English set of tenets. And I was like, this is great. And he's like, yeah, I use GenAI to build that through My Assistant. I use My Assistant to build that. Another case we're using is for claims. If an associate makes a medical claim, there may be 100 entries, doctors, nurses, insurance company. And so when we're trying to process those, it would take a day or two for people to go through some of the more complicated claims. We built a summarization engine on top of that so that they can come in and see everything that's been done to date and move that from a day or two to an hour or two to get through those. And so what we're finding is as we teach business partners what is possible, they come up with an endless set of use cases. And so that's what I mean by bottom up.
Okay, so Can you talk a little bit more about the fintech applications of Gen AI at Walmart and like the payroll? How do you use it in that use case?
Yeah, uh, what I consider our most sacrosanct duty is to pay our associates accurately and timely. And so over the years, you've had humans who are looking through, does this make sense? Or do we see any anomalies in running a set of tests? What we want to use is scale up AI for anomaly detection so that we're looking at where do we see things that might be wrong, and how do we have someone investigate and follow up on that. And so that gives me a lot of trust in the system that we're using, that we can touch all the different possible permutations, and deliver the right pay to the right associates every 2 weeks.
Okay, sounds good. So I don't think we've talked about this yet, but guardrails, safety guardrails. So I know you have them. You think a lot about putting those in place, but is this mostly for like IP security? But are there other aspects of safety, like maybe privacy or accuracy?
Yeah, I mean, security and privacy are paramount. We think about these every time we do something with Gen AI or even without Gen AI. It's our number one priority. We talk about guardrails, and that's where we're starting. And I think of guardrails as if you've already left the lane and you're out of control, like it'll keep you from rolling off the mountain. I'd like to think of it more like lane lines. We should start with guardrails, but like how do we make it lane lines worth of guardrails? Meaning, let's do the right thing and drive in the right direction every time, rather than have this thing that only catches us when we go out of control. And so we're getting more and more precise in what we find and how we protect our associates.
Sounds good. Okay, could you talk a little bit about build or buy? Like you've got to buy some stuff and you got to develop other stuff. And I don't think you're developing your own large language model. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure. But you are designing a lot and building a lot of stuff. So please talk a little bit about that build or buy.
Yeah, yeah, this is a great question. Every time we want to build a functionality, every time we want to have a functionality, we have to choose whether to build it or buy it. And there's lots of companies out there who would love to work for Walmart or work with Walmart. What we found often is that third-party software doesn't scale to 2 million associates. Third party doesn't scale to $600 billion. And so we have to be very thoughtful about both, do they have the right functionality, and can they meet our availability, resiliency, performance, and security requirements. And so while we want to make build versus buy decisions as we go, my general intuition and bias is that we should build as much as we can in house, because we can configure it, we can scale it, and we'll have the flexibility to do exactly what Walmart needs. With Gen AI specifically, we use a variety of LLMs, and we built our own abstraction layer. It's a platform called Element. And the nice thing about that is that we can have a team that's completely focused on what is the best set of LLMs to use. And then I, as an application developer, can sit on top of that platform. And I don't have to worry about the nuts and bolts of which model we're using, or you know, which we don't want to use. I can just build, and the platform takes care of the details.
Does that involve building your own vector databases for different applications?
Yeah, you have an underlying model, but then I have my own vector database. And one of the examples I have is we own the benefits help desk. And so our benefits guide is a 300-page document, which associates go through, and sometimes they need help. They can't get through all the 300 pages or get to the right page. And so they call our benefits help desk. And our agents can help them, but the guide changes pretty regularly. And so if you think about, would you rather have a human memorize a 300-page benefits guide or an LLM? It seems like it's a great place for the LLM to work with us.
For sure. So you've talked about some of the potential for Gen AI and the existing use of it, but what are some of the pitfalls and challenges and things you want to avoid when you're using it?
Yeah, it's funny because in this case I talked about before, we set up a vector DB, and one of the engineers dumped the benefits guide into it over the weekend, and like it answered 90% of the questions right Monday morning. And it was like, wow, that's great. We've got our thing running. But, you know, when you're answering questions about people's benefits, you have to be perfect. And so, the thing about Gen AI is it's very powerful, but it's also probabilistic, not deterministic. And so if an associate asks, am I insured to get this surgery? and we say yes, and it turns out that they aren't, it turns out we were wrong, that's a very expensive mistake for them and for us. And so the building the right safeguards and using it in the right applications. So again, take the benefits help desk concept. Part of the job is discovery. So an associate calls in and says, "I need insurance." Like, we can have the LLM guide our agent through what questions to ask them so that we get to the right answer or the right question, sort of get to the starting line. And then we can have a more deterministic set of answers, which either the LLM can guide the agent to, or the agent can go directly to and give them the right answer. So part of the challenge with AI is you have this powerful tool, but using it in the right way, where when it's good enough to be probabilistic, whereas if you need a deterministic answer, maybe you don't want to use GenAI for that just yet.
That is a good answer. I hadn't heard it explained that way. So one thing I wanted to ask you about this. So you guys are, as well as a builder of technology, you're also a user. So what would you like to see more from the vendors, the companies you do buy technology from? What would you like to see more from them, and what would you like to see less? You don't have to name any names, of course.
Yeah. So one of the things I've been pushing is, rather than buy a whole system from a vendor, can we just get an API? So, one of the things that I intersect with is like sales tax. There's hundreds of thousands of jurisdictions and minute rules around sales tax around the country. One that always sticks in my mind is like a mosquito abatement zone in Minnesota or Wisconsin. Like, that's something where we'd love to have a third party help us keep up with those things, but we don't want to have their whole workflow. We just want them to tell us, if we give you a zip code and if we give you an amount of money, you tell us what the sales tax is on that. And we can do that through an API. And that's sort of loosely coupling, and that's how software is going in the last decade or two.
Got it. Okay. So, all right. So you talked a little bit about my assistant earlier and the news release example. But what other kind of uses are you finding by monitoring how the associates use their LLM tool?
Yeah, what we found is, if you allow associates to innovate, they will find interesting things. I'll give you an example from another experience I had, which is there was a merchant sales teams who would be responsible for getting sellers to sign up on the platform, just like Walmart does. And there was one associate who outpaced everybody else, and they went to her and said, "What are you doing?" And this was, I don't know if you read Tim Ferriss's book, The 4 Hour Work Week, but he talked about, and this was 15 years ago, they talked about virtual assistants in India. And so she said, every day at the end of the day, I send a list of sellers to India, and I come back the next morning. They've done a lot of research, and they've told us, which ones I should go deep on and what questions I should ask. And so the magic from that is take that idea the associate has and scale it up to let everybody use that, because it's no good for her to be 10 times more productive. We'd like everybody to be 10 times productive. And so, as we put these use cases out to associates, they find interesting and things to do with it that we had no idea of,
Do they
or we wouldn't have thought of
do,
by just sitting down
do they
and
have
talking
to
to
pre-clear their proposed applications beforehand?
them. We do want them to experiment through My Assistant, and we want as little guardrails as possible on that, but we want to make sure we don't leak IP, we don't leak PII. Aside from those, we want people to be inventive. And we also have monitoring to see what people are using it for, both to figure out what to scale, but also to make sure that our IP is not leaving the firewall.
Okay, I hear that. So, how do you measure the ROI of Gen AI in your?
I mean, how do you measure the ROI of anything? Really, it's a real challenge. But thinking about, for this application, for this task that used to take me 2 hours, I can do it in 2 minutes. Or for this task I used to do in 2 days, I can do it in 1 hour. And so we can do these micro measurements to say, oh, we saved this much time, and we know how many of these things we've done. How many, for lack of a better term, how many widgets we need to make, and how long it took us before, and how long it took after. So you probably won't see it at a macro scale. I always joke that epidemic is something that so big that epidemiologists can measure it at a macro scale. This kind of same thing is what we're going to do is make a bunch of micro changes, which will make our operators more efficient, make our customer searches more efficient, and help them find the right item and ideally spend more money with us. But each of these spots, we're going to see micro improvements, and then at some point we need to roll those all up, and that ends up in earnings.
Got it. Okay, so let's just switch gears a little bit. I found it fascinating your background. You not only worked for I think 10 years at Amazon, but also I think you're trained as a physicist, if I'm not correct.
Yeah.
So how does a physicist get into the software business? And and when did you decide that commerce was your main was your going to be your career path instead of physics? And what kind of stuff did you do at Amazon, and how can you transfer that to your current job?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I was not a very good physicist. And so I decided I wish I would have said I had a thought that I was definitely going to go do e-commerce. But when I left with my PhD, my wife also got a PhD. We moved to Seattle. We said wherever she got a postdoc, we would move there. And so we went there, and Amazon was the only people who would hire me. So that's why I got into e-commerce. But some of the lessons I learned as a physicist, probably the most important one is first principles thinking. You hear some about that lately, but what are the specific things that we can't do because they're constrained by the laws of physics? Let's not do those, and then let's think about the universe of other things that we could do. And so, staying on the critical path of what's the simplest thing? How do we focus? I learned all of that in grad school. The second thing, which I jokingly share, is that when you're a grad student, nobody cares about your project as much as you do. And so if you don't drive it, if you don't work hard on it, you could be there for 5, 10, 15 years. And so the idea that you have to be the driver of your own success, that's a great learning that you can apply everywhere. My first job when I got out of grad school was project manager. And it was perfect because nobody cared about my project as much as I did. And so I was able to apply this focus that I learned in grad school to driving projects, whether it's setting up a warehouse or launching a new website.
Okay, so what about at Amazon? Did you use Gen AI there? And what were some of your response? What are some of the stuff you did there that you could transfer over to your Walmart?
Yeah, I mean, I left Amazon 5 or 6 years ago, and so there was no such thing as Gen AI back then. But what I found is, I worked in warehousing, supporting the warehouses. We owned the warehouse management system. I worked in retail, building automation for different functions and so on. But what I found is whatever the domain is, you focus on product, process, and people. And so, when you're junior, you're building products. When you're sort of mid tier, you are building processes to help folks be more effective. And then when you get to be senior, the VP or senior VP, you are focused on who are the right people to do these jobs and build these processes for you. And so it's interesting that, whether you're at Amazon or whether you're at Walmart, whether you're working on operations, whether you're working on back office system, getting the right people, the right technologists in the right seats is kind of the most important thing at my level. And so I think that's the biggest takeaway I've taken throughout my career is focus on doing right by your people and finding great people. And that makes a lot of problems go away.
Speaking of technologists, are you at all using Gen AI to write code, debug code, make the coding process faster?
We are, but we're doing it very carefully. We talk about guardrails, is we don't want to leak our IP into any of these big LLMs. And so we're taking a somewhat circumspect look at how we do this, starting with sort of test code generation and maybe like move off the mainframe. How do we translate from COBOL to Java and so on? So right now, today, we are not yet doing our core development with that, but I think everybody is sort of salivating to figure out once it becomes safe, how can we 10x the productivity of our engineers?
I was at IBM Think conference last week or the week before, and they talked a lot about some of their partners and customers talked about updating old COBOL code, and that was a really good use of IBM's code writing LLM. Do you think that would be a good use, an initial application in the coding area?
I think it is. It's it's taking the business logic that's encoded in COBOL on the mainframe and has been for decades. And how do you take the business logic, which is the valuable part, the actual lines of code isn't valuable, it's the business logic. And how do you turn that into something modern that you can, write in Java or whatever language you like, on a hyperscaler or on our own, service-based cloud?
Okay, which brings me probably to my last question, and that is your cloud strategy. How do you set it up? I think it's hybrid, and how does it interact with your Gen AI tools?
Yeah, we do have a hybrid cloud, as you said. We work with a couple hyperscalers, and then we have our own private cloud. And this allows us flexibility to both obviously save cost while also being elastic, but allows us to say, what are the places where we want to buy our own GPUs, and scale up our own LLM, or run Gen AI in our own cloud versus, how can we take the best of breed from the hyperscalers? With Gen AI specifically, it's such a new area. It was only a year and a half ago, November 22, when it sort of had the chat GPT moment, for a lack of a better term. And so things change every single day. So we don't want to make a huge capital investment until we know what we're doing. And so that's a great way where we can make some of our own capital investment in private cloud, but also leverage the best of the breed out there as we are learning.
Well, LLMs, as we all know, are compute intensive. So I'm sure that
Yeah.
factors into what's more economical to use your private cloud, your data centers, or the hyperscalers. So how do you and do you think the price of compute for Gen AI is coming down?
Yeah, I think it's going to be super deflationary. That today, nobody knows from month to month what the actual use of the power is going to be, or use of GPUs are, because there's a new model coming out every month. And you're seeing, you're spending a lot of money on training models, but then there's a lot of money spent on inference. But that, when I read about money being spent on inference, it's like, oh, I could run it on a big, in the cloud. Then it's like, oh, I can run it on my laptop. Then I can run it on my phone to do the inference. And so we're already seeing massive increases in efficiency, and I expect that to go on for the next, maybe forever. If you think about the equivalent of Moore's law for GPUs rather than CPUs.
For sure. And I think this actually will be my last question, and then I'll close out. Um, Open source or proprietary? What's Walmart's preferred approach to AI?
I mean, I think it's all of the above, right? We built a platform which sits on top of both the hyperscalers' proprietary models plus any open source models. And I think back to I don't know if you remember the Netflix recommendation contest they had. It was like $1 million award for the best recommendations engine. And what the people who won used was, they took 15 different models and averaged them. And so, again, there's pragmatic and dogmatic. Like, the philosophy I have is like, let's try to figure out how to use the best of breed, whether it's open source or proprietary. And maybe you run the same query against 5 different sources, and if they all agree, fantastic. But you probably learn much more when they all disagree, or some of them disagree. And so, starting with running the queries against several different models, and then looking at the times that they disagree, you can find a lot of interesting information there.
All right. Well, thanks, David. I'm going to let you go. It's been really informative. Thanks for being a guest on the Targeting AI podcast. And everybody, all of the listeners know where to find Walmart. And to listen to this podcast, just please come to techtarget.com. And I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.